We're joined by Senor, co-founder of the Foreign Policy Initiative. I don't want to spring it on you, but did you see yesterday, did you read Hirsi Ali's piece?
Yes,
okay.
It was excellent.
So it was excellent.
Yeah.
And you get rid of ISIS, you don't necessarily get rid of Islamic extremism. You need to deal with it. And the model that we have right now is Israel, and the way Israel deals with it. And that's sort of what you're here to tell us today.
Right. Well, no. Israel has dealt with a population within its borders, effectively.
That's what I mean. Not Islamic extremism necessarily, but the way to deal with...
a population within its borders, which
barbarians in your midst.
Some elements of which are at war with your country. Yeah. And Israel is engaged in a number of security and surveillance techniques, preventative arrests, all the rest, to I mean, the kind of terrorist attack that happened in Paris was almost impossible in Israel today.
Say that.
Well, for instance, there's basic security in any facility that is hosting large numbers of people. You can't walk into a cafe today in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, Netanya or Haifa, in a cafe, a concert hall, any kind of public space without them checking your bag, searching you down. The idea that someone could walk into a hall or a sports stadium with suicide bomb vests is unheard of in Israel.
Well, they actually stopped at the stadium.
At the stadium, but one of them remained outside. Right. And in the concerts and the bars. So there's preventative arrest, there's intense surveillance, so that's all very important. But the reality is, these are all symptoms. Like all these things that Ayan was talking about in her op-ed yesterday, which was important, are symptoms. Unless we deal with the sanctuary in Syria and Iraq, we are not going to deal with this problem.
Yeah, just a question, though. Sticking on the Israeli society, I don't think of them as having a closed society, so to speak. We talk about what open societies, the Western societies are, and I kind of put Israel in that camp. Am I wrong?
It is a very free and democratic society. There's a dynamic, free speech debate, multiple newspapers. Most critical of the Israeli government are the Israeli newspapers or the Israeli Arab newspapers. So in that respect, yes, but there is a high tolerance in Israeli society for doing things in terms of surveillance, in terms of infiltrating attacks before they happen by going after people that you just suspect. Profiling. I mean, it's the human profile. If you go in and out of an Israeli airport, the interrogation you go through effectively just to get on and off a plane, which just takes a couple of minutes, but these people are trained to not rely on technology, but to do real human profiling.
And safety is in that culture, though.
Oh, correct.
They're very focused on safety for themselves and their families, and they're willing to give up to do that.
Correct. So my advice as Ayan's to the leaders in Europe, particularly France, would be to get close to the Israeli leadership right now, because I actually think the threat in France and other European countries is even more severe today than what Israel is.
But do you think culturally they will ever move?
This is the key question. European society has to have a reckoning with itself, because they have created a culture where they are so proud of this tolerance they have for these balkanized communities, these communities that are so unintegrated and so unassimilated with the rest of European society, and have been protected as such. The idea of surveilling mosques, the idea of preventative arrests against leaders who are indoctrinating in these mosques, extremists, the idea of monitoring and shutting down these websites that are the machinery of indoctrination is unheard of in Europe. And so for European leaders to deal with this reality and do the things that I think are necessary is not going to be easy. This is the threshold debate here. Look, we have a layer of protection. All right, not the least of which is an ocean. So you have these refugees coming into Europe, at least one of whom was directly involved with this attack in Europe. It would be much harder for that person to get here. We don't have communities that are as balkanized here as they are in Europe. They're not as, we integrate and we assimilate. So there's much more integration. So that adds a layer of protection.
We also have good neighbors with Mexico and Canada.
Correct. So. And since 9/11, the consolidation of our intelligence agencies, what the NSA has been able to do, the metadata collection program, the Patriot Act, some of the things we've done, the developing of the Homeland Security Department has given us some Homeland Security capabilities that simply don't exist in Europe today. So we have a layer of protection, but it's cold comfort. In other words, we shouldn't sit back and say, we're in the clear. Because it is very easy for someone to paralyze a major city with the kind of attack we saw in Paris last Friday, that we saw in Madrid in 2004, that we saw in Mumbai in 2008. Big cities, are very vulnerable to 10 or 12 people with a lot of machine guns and explosives to shut the city down.
Robert Hormats was here yesterday, and he made an interesting point, just that some of the far-right parties, Marine Le Pen, in France are anti-American, that they're more likely to align themselves with Russia than with us. So if you see some of them getting elected, it could mean bigger troubles for our relationships with France.
Absolutely. I mean, Russia, in many respects, speaks to them. It's a hard-right, autocratic approach to foreign policy. It's completely ruthless. I mean, Putin today is in Syria. We're barely in Syria, but Putin today is in Syria because it is a cutthroat, do whatever you have to do to survive, deal with external threats, deal with domestic threats. And that, I think, it appeals to these politicians who are on the right. And it's not just in France. There's a party on the right, on the rise in Germany, in Sweden, in Netherlands. I mean, you are seeing these parties on the rise. Look at the government in Hungary.
We had Colonel Jack Jacobs on yesterday, and he said the only way to solve this problem is to put boots on the ground.
Yes.
There's no other way to stabilize the situation.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Colonel Jacobs. But there are several military leaders, who believe, as Colonel Jacobs does, that if you actually want to rebuild and sort of recreate Syrian society, it will require a true commitment on the scale that Colonel Jacobs is recommending. But I don't think that needs to be the priority right now. The priority right now needs to be there's a sanctuary. It is very hard. We can talk about all these preventative measures, surveillance, domestic security, homeland security. Unless you deal with this sanctuary, there are tens of thousands of people being trained in these training camps in Syria and Iraq that can launch attacks. Unless you disrupt that sanctuary, nothing else matters. And that doesn't require 250,000 troops. Right now, our military operations, our air operations in Syria, about 75% of the planes returning don't drop ordnance. We are barely touching these ISIS strongholds. So stronger air capabilities. You need some ground capabilities to do that, to coordinate these air operations. But I do not believe to disrupt the sanctuary, you need the 250,000 troops that Jack is talking about.
It's a sad commentary, and maybe you won't admit it, but for a second, because of the vacuum of leadership, maybe that we have here now, when you saw Putin, I was like, wow, Putin. That's the guy. Maybe that's the guy we need to go after. It's almost like, well, there's a guy
who's tough and ruthless and gets it done. I get it.
What am I thinking? But I guarantee you, a lot of people were saying now something's going to happen because it's the enemy of the enemy. I mean, ISIS is worse than we think of, even in Ukraine and all the stuff that Putin, all of his bad acting.
Right.
It's like, wow, finally we got a guy in there who might.
And when you watch President Obama's press conference yesterday,
well, I wasn't going to bring that up because it's too easy.
It's just too easy. Perplexing because he was basically saying what I'm doing is working, and he sets up this straw man that if you're not with me, you're for World War III.
When are you going to bring it up? It's just too easy. Too easy. It's unbelievable.
It's unlike you to just not to avoid the easy, the more easy targets. You did.
I was flabbergasted.